My name is Shane, and I'm going to be discussing Bach's Prelude in D minor, that's C minor for lute, which is BWV 999. And specifically I'm going to address measure 15. That measure is a bit of a beast for a lot of guitarists. It involves an extremely large stretch that spans 5 full frets. And it creates a challenge for a lot of people. I am going to play the first 16 bars just to give you an idea of how the piece sounds. So that's basically the first 16 or so measures with one really rough spot there. Like I said, it's not performance ready. But what I really want to discuss though is measure 15. Measure 15 consists of this massive F major 7 chord. It spans the low E and all the way up to the top. And it's a huge stretch for many players. Between the first finger and the pinky. I've seen a lot of discussion how to handle this measure on the internet, and there are a lot of different strategies, and I want to give you my perspective from one very small-handed individual. Now, one of the things I think is really important, particularly with anything that involves a large stretch, if you haven't worked on a large stretch with your hands, is don't overdo your practice. It took me weeks to get to the point where my stretch was comfortable, and I actually even kind of injured myself at first, just strained the muscles. That's not good. There were, over the time, I discovered several strategies that I saw people discussing on the internet on how to address this. Some people had videos up, other people just talk about them on forums. And some of the number one suggested version, and it's personally the one that I recommend, is first index finger on the E, or on the E string on first fret for that F, and then bar the top 3 strings on the 5th fret. Now, getting this right actually is a bit of a delicate balance for me, at least, because I can't put my first finger down too terribly heavily on the F note, because that tends to take away from some of the pressure that my pinky has to put across 3 strings. So I had to learn to just get that just perfect amount of pressure with the first finger, not too much, not too little. Too much and I'm not getting enough pressure with my pinky. Too little and the F will buzz when I hit the E string. I had to actually, when I first was doing it, swing my elbow forward a bit and arch my wrist and keep my finger curved a little bit, my index finger curved. Letting it flatten out tightened up the tendons in my arm and wrist and created problems for me. And was probably why I got some repetitive strain issues with it. All because of this one measure. Another way that I've seen people play it, and I can't really do it well, so I'm not going to suggest it to other people, but is playing each one of those notes with individual fingers. I can barely do it. It takes some practice and stretching. It's not smooth. I cannot do it moving from one measure into the next and then out into the next measure after that. People with larger fingers might be able to do it. When I do it, I think it sounds cleaner and clearer, but it's not reliable for me. Okay, the next option is playing the F, not on the low E, but instead on the D. It's an octave F. Technically, you've got the same chord, and it sounds harmonically correct. It is, of the alternatives, I think probably the most true alternative fingering that you can go with. One of my concerns about using that method, though, is the melody in the bass line throughout the entire piece starts with lower notes going up high, middle, low again. So it does that throughout the entire piece. The pattern is the same consistently. When you get to the measures, get to that measure, if you go up to that F, you change that pattern and it's a little inconsistent. So it sound, instead of like this, it would then sound like. I think it changes the tone of the piece too much. It's acceptable, but personally it isn't my preference. Another option is, instead of playing a low F, you play a low E. So you end up with a chord, with a measure that sounds like this. It still sounds good. It's very pleasing to the ear. It's easy to play, but I don't think that it should be done. One of the big reasons why is it is a completely different note, and it does change the chord structure. The other reason why is, throughout the piece, Bach seems particularly careful not to repeat measures or patterns too often with the chords. And in measure 15, if you play that with a low E instead of a low F, it actually opens that measure exactly the same way that measure 19, just a few measures later, starts, at the beginning of this growing swell as the piece works chromatically up the neck. And I think it's the most dramatic part of the piece. So when you use that low E there, you're kind of taking away from the gravity of the moment that's going to come later on in the piece. That's just entirely a musical interpretation aspect on my part, but I really don't agree with that strategy, so I don't recommend it. Another thing that I kind of have fun doing with this piece and other arpeggio style studies like this is swap out the right hand picking patterns from other arpeggio studies by other composers, such as maybe Dionisio Aguado, Mauro Guiliani, or Carulli. Because I've got books with some of their stuff in them, so it gives me a nice alternative to sight reading and forces me to think about playing any of those pieces differently from how I've let muscle memory work in my play. So, at any rate, I really hope you enjoyed this talk or could take something away from it, or maybe you can teach me something and point out other errors I've made. So, thank you very much, and you have a great evening.